She had a private jet. She had a penthouse in London overlooking the Thames. She had built a company from a single laptop, in a studio apartment, surviving on rice and black coffee, into a firm managing over $2 billion in assets. Her name had appeared on the cover of Forbes not once but twice. At 36 years old, Vivian Ellison was the kind of success story that business schools put in their textbooks and that young women taped above their desks as proof that it was possible. She had flown in private. She had sat across the table from prime ministers and presidents of corporations. She had closed deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars in a single afternoon. She was, by every measure the world uses to count success, extraordinary. But none of that mattered on this particular Wednesday morning in October, when Vivian was not in London and she was not in a boardroom. She was standing on the rotting porch of an abandoned house on the edge of a forgotten street in Houston, Texas, with the cold morning air biting through her coat and her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. The boards of the porch sagged under her feet. The paint on the front door had peeled back in long strips that curled away from the wood-like skin that had given up. One of the windows on the side of the house was boarded over with a plank of old lumber. The yard had not been touched in months. Weeds had grown so high at the base of the porch steps that they had swallowed the bottom two entirely. She could hear something faint from inside the house. A radio. Playing low. Something old. She raised her hand and knocked. Once. Then again. And then the door opened. And the man standing in the dim light of that broken doorway, thin and gray-haired and dressed in a worn flannel shirt she recognized from years ago, was her father. Thomas Ellison. The man who once owned the largest construction company on the Gulf Coast. The man who had mortgaged everything he owned to send her to London with a suitcase and a dream. The man who, every single Sunday evening for the past several years, had answered her phone calls and told her that everything was fine. She looked at him. She looked past him into the interior of the house. She saw the cot against the wall. She saw the small camp stove on the kitchen counter. She saw the single bare light bulb hanging from the ceiling on its wire. And she understood in one single, shattering moment that while she had been building a billion-dollar empire abroad, her father had been living in an abandoned house and telling her everything was fine. She could not speak. She could not move. She just stood on that sagging porch and looked at the man who had given her everything. And the world she thought she understood cracked open right down the middle. If this opening already has your heart, pause for just 1 second and drop a comment telling us what you felt in that moment when she saw the cot. Your reaction tells us you are the kind of person this story was made for. And if you are new here, hit that subscribe button right now because the story you are about to hear goes so much deeper than you think. Now let us go all the way back to the very beginning. Thomas Ellison was not born into anything. He came into the world in a small, loud house on the south side of Houston in 1958, the second of 3 sons born to a man named Gerald and a woman named Ruth. Gerald Ellison worked at a car repair shop for 31 years. He came home every evening with grease on his knuckles that never fully washed out, and he sat at the same spot at the kitchen table every night, and he ate whatever Ruth had put together from whatever was in the refrigerator, and he never once complained about any of it in front of his children. Ruth cleaned houses for wealthier families across town 3 days a week and spent the other days managing the household with the kind of quiet efficiency that nobody outside that house ever fully appreciated or understood. They were not poor in the way that makes the news. They were poor in the older, quieter way. The way where you stretch what you have and you budget for emergencies that you know are coming eventually and you do not talk in front of the children about what is not there. Thomas absorbed all of it. He watched his father move through the world with a dignity that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with character, and something inside him took root in those years that would never leave him regardless of what happened later. He would build something. Something real. Something that lasted. Not because he was ashamed of where he came from but because he wanted to honor it by going further than it had taken his father. He started doing construction work the summer after his junior year of high school. He was 17 years old, already broad-shouldered and physically capable in the way that comes from years of helping with whatever needed doing around a house that could not afford to pay someone else to do it. He swept job sites. He carried materials. He ran to get things for the older workers who did not have time to stop working. And he watched. He watched how buildings came together from the ground up. He watched how a foundation was poured and what happened if it was not done right. He watched how walls were framed and how roofs were set and what the difference was between a building that would last and a building that would not. He had an instinct for it that surprised even the men who had been doing it for decades. By the time he was 22, he had learned enough to run a small crew on residential jobs around the Houston suburbs. By the time he was 25, he was leading projects that more experienced men were glad to hand off to him because he made fewer mistakes than they did. By 27, he had borrowed enough money from 2 separate bank loans and enough credibility from his reputation to start his own company. He called it Ellison Construction. Just his name. He was not trying to build a brand. He was trying to build a business. There was a difference and he understood it from day one. The early years were genuinely difficult. The loans had to be serviced. The competition in Houston's construction market was fierce and established. There were months when Thomas paid his workers before he paid himself and months when he did not pay himself at all because the cash flow did not allow it. He drove a truck that had over 200,000 miles on it and wore the same work boots for 4 years until the soles wore through in a way that could no longer be repaired. But he showed up every day. He returned every phone call. He finished every job on time and under budget. He fixed his own mistakes without billing the client for the fix. He hired people who were trustworthy and he treated them the way Gerald had always treated the people he worked alongside, which was with respect and consistency and the understanding that a man's word was either worth something or it was worth nothing and there was no middle ground. Word got around. In Houston's construction industry, reputation travels faster than any advertisement. By the time Thomas was in his mid-30s, Ellison Construction had grown into a company with a genuine reputation across the Gulf Coast. Commercial buildings. Residential developments. School renovation projects. Road infrastructure. Thomas had built all of it. He had a 2-story home in a quiet neighborhood in northwest Houston, a truck he was genuinely proud of, and a wife named Margaret who had been teaching 4th grade at a public elementary school in the city for 12 years and who was, by every honest measure, the best person he had ever met. Margaret Ellison was the kind of woman who made everything around her calmer and more reasonable just by being present in it. She was a teacher not just by profession but by nature. She was patient in a way that was not passive. She was warm in a way that did not make her soft. She laughed easily and read constantly and had opinions about everything worth having opinions about, and she expressed them clearly and without apology. She and Thomas had met at a church social event when Thomas was 29 and Margaret was 27, and from the very first conversation he had known. He had told his mother that same evening, coming home from the event, that he had met the woman he was going to marry. His mother had laughed and told him not to rush. He married her 14 months later. They had a daughter in the spring of 1988. They named her Vivian. And from the moment Vivian Ellison came home from the hospital and Thomas held her in the living room of the house he had built his life around, his entire understanding of what he was working for rearranged itself completely and permanently. Thomas raised Vivian with a combination of presence and intention that most children never experience and all children deserve. He drove her to school every morning without exception, including on the days when the job site started at 6 and he had to leave directly from the school drop-off. He helped with homework at the kitchen table in the evenings, even on the nights when he had been working since before sunrise and his body was asking him to stop. He attended every school event she ever had. Every class play, every science fair presentation, every soccer match in the rain on a muddy field that he watched from the bleachers wrapped in a jacket that was not quite warm enough because he had forgotten it would be this cold and he was not going to leave to go get a better one. He was not a man who said the words easily or often. But he was a man who showed up. Every single time. And in the language that children actually understand, which is not words but presence, Vivian grew up knowing beyond any possibility of doubt that she was the most important thing in her father's life. She was sharp from her earliest years. Not just intelligent in the way that shows up on tests, but curious and driven in the way that cannot be taught or assigned. She wanted to know how everything worked. She read books that were well above her grade level not because anyone told her to but because she found them and was interested. In middle school she ran a candy resale business out of her backpack, buying in bulk from a wholesale supplier she had found on her own and selling to classmates at a markup that she had calculated with a precision that made her math teacher pause when she explained the model. The principal shut it down after 6 weeks. Thomas laughed about it for years. He laughed not just because it was funny but because it told him something about who his daughter was that no parent's heart could receive without swelling. She was going to be extraordinary. He had known it for years but this confirmed it in a specific and practical way. When Vivian was 16 she told her father she wanted to study international finance at the London School of Economics. She had researched the programs. She had looked into the admission requirements. She had identified the scholarships she was likely to qualify for and the gap that would remain after those scholarships were applied. She presented all of this to her father at the kitchen table on a Saturday morning with her notes spread in front of her and her expression communicating clearly that this was not a wish or a fantasy but a plan. Thomas looked at his daughter across that kitchen table for a long moment. He looked at her notes. He looked at her face. And something moved through him that fathers feel in those particular moments when a child becomes fully visible to them as a person rather than just as a child. A pride so large and so specific that it sits in the chest like a physical weight. He told her that if London was where she needed to go, then that was where she was going. No hesitation. No qualification. Just yes. And he meant it so completely that he never once reconsidered it, not even in the months that followed when he sat down with the actual numbers and understood exactly what it was going to cost him. The cost was real. Tuition at the London School of Economics, combined with housing and living costs in one of the most expensive cities in the world, was far beyond what Thomas could cover from operating cash without destroying the business. He refinanced 2 properties he owned outright and pulled significant equity from the company. His accountant sat across from him and went through the numbers twice and suggested alternative approaches. Thomas listened to all of it. He understood the concern. And then he signed the papers anyway. He told the accountant what he had told Margaret the night before when she had raised the same concern gently and from a place of love. He said his daughter was the best investment he had ever made and he was not wrong about that. The accountant nodded and prepared the documents. There was nothing left to discuss. The morning Vivian left for London was a September morning with a low grey sky and a damp cold that came off the Gulf Coast in the early fall. Thomas had driven her to the airport himself. He had loaded her bags into the car the night before and double-checked them twice. He made her scrambled eggs and toast before they left even though she told him she was too nervous to eat and then she ate all of it. At the airport he carried her bags to the check-in counter and stood beside her while she checked in and answered the agent's questions. When the bags had been taken and the boarding passes printed, he walked with her to the security line. They stood there for a moment. Thomas was not a man who made scenes. He was not going to fall apart in the middle of George Bush Intercontinental Airport. He put his arms around her and held on for one moment longer than he would have otherwise, and then he stepped back and put his hands in his jacket pockets and told her to call him when she landed. Vivian said she would. She said she loved him. He said he loved her too. She walked through the security door and disappeared around the corner. Thomas stood at the line for another full minute even though she was already gone. Then he walked back to the parking garage, got into his truck, and sat behind the wheel for a while before starting the engine. On the drive home the roads were wet and the radio was on and he was not really listening to it. He was thinking about a little girl who used to fall asleep in the back seat on the drive home from job sites, and a young woman who was now on her way to London with a plan already forming behind her eyes. He was proud in the deepest possible way. And underneath the pride, running quiet and cold like water under ice, was the knowledge that the house he was going home to was going to feel very different now. London transformed Vivian Ellison. Not in the way that changes who a person fundamentally is, but in the way that sharpens and clarifies and expands what was already there. The London School of Economics placed her alongside students from 40 countries with different financial systems, different market structures, different frameworks for thinking about how money moved and why. She absorbed all of it. She was in the library when other students were out. She built relationships with professors who were doing real work in the field and offered herself as a research assistant without being asked, working unpaid hours on projects that gave her access to thinking that would take her years to develop on her own. She graduated with distinction. It was not a surprise to anyone who had watched her work. She stayed in London after graduation. She took a junior position at a boutique investment firm on Mayfair that specialized in technology companies in emerging markets. It was a small firm with a sharp reputation and extremely high standards. Vivian was the youngest person in the office and one of the least experienced, and she treated both of those facts as fuel rather than disadvantage. She arrived before anyone else. She stayed after everyone had gone home. She read everything she could find. She asked questions that were good enough that the senior partners started inviting her into meetings she had not technically been assigned to. Within 3 years she had been promoted twice. Within 5 years she was a senior analyst whose name the firm's clients were specifically requesting. Within 7 years she left to start her own firm. She called it Ellison Capital. She registered it in London, built the initial team of 4 people, and went to work. The thesis was specific and defensible. She was looking for undervalued technology companies in Southeast Asia and the Middle East and Sub-Saharan Africa that had strong fundamentals and no access to the capital that would allow them to scale. She would provide that capital and the strategic guidance that came with it, take a meaningful stake, and help build them into something. The returns in the first 2 years were not just good. They were the kind of returns that make other investors pay attention in a way that is impossible to manufacture and very difficult to maintain. But Vivian maintained them. Because she was not guessing. She was seeing things that other people were not seeing, which is the actual job, and she was right more often than she was wrong, which is the only thing that ultimately matters in this business. Within 4 years of founding Ellison Capital, the firm had grown from 4 employees to over 60, from offices in London to offices in 3 additional cities, and from a modest first fund to a third fund that was substantially oversubscribed. Vivian's personal net worth, a combination of her carry interest and her own investments in the portfolio, had crossed the $1 billion mark. She was 34 years old. Forbes Europe put her on the cover. The headline read, "The Quiet Billionaire." She gave the interview because her communications team said it was the right move for the firm's profile. She was thoughtful and precise in her answers, and the piece described her as formidably intelligent and notably private. She went back to work the afternoon the interview was published. She had a board meeting at 3. Through all of it, she called her father on Sunday evenings. Thomas always picked up. He always sounded the same. Warm, steady, engaged, asking about the business before she could ask about him. He wanted to know about the deals she was working on, the cities she was traveling to, whether she was sleeping and eating properly. He was genuinely interested and asked questions that showed he had been paying attention to previous conversations. He was careful, always, to reveal very little about himself. He talked about Houston, about the weather, about a neighbor he had spoken to recently, about a game he had watched on television. He stayed in the broad and the surface and moved away from specifics whenever she pushed toward them. And Vivian, moving at the speed of someone building a firm that was doubling in assets under management every 18 months, accepted his reassurances because she was busy and because believing them was easier than not believing them. She told herself she would visit soon. She had been telling herself that for a while. Here is what Thomas Ellison never told his daughter on those Sunday phone calls. 3 years after Vivian left for London, Margaret was diagnosed with an aggressive form of ovarian cancer. Thomas found out on a Thursday afternoon in November, sitting in the car in the parking lot of a medical building while Margaret was still inside with the doctor going over the next steps. She came out carrying a folder of papers and got into the passenger seat and sat there for a moment before she spoke. She told him the diagnosis and the prognosis and what the recommended treatment protocol looked like. Thomas listened to all of it without speaking. When she finished, he asked her 2 questions. He asked whether she was afraid. She said yes. He said him too. Then he asked what she wanted to do about Vivian. Margaret looked out through the windshield for a long moment. Then she said she did not want Vivian to come back. Not yet. Not until they knew more. She had worked too hard and come too far, and Margaret was not going to let this derail her at the moment when everything she had worked for was starting to take real shape. Thomas disagreed. They talked about it more than once over the days that followed. In the end, he respected what Margaret wanted because she was the one going through it and because her reasons came entirely from love. He kept the diagnosis from Vivian. He told her her mother had been a little under the weather and was resting. He told himself he would tell her when the time was right. He sat beside his wife through surgery and 4 rounds of chemotherapy and the months that got progressively harder and the weeks at the end that were the hardest thing he had ever done in his life. He slept in the chair beside her hospital bed in the final weeks because he could not bring himself to go home to a house that felt too large and too quiet without her in it. Margaret Ellison died on a Tuesday in February. She was 58 years old. Thomas called Vivian that evening. He sat at the kitchen table with the phone in his hand for a long time before he dialed. Vivian picked up on the second ring and he told her as gently and directly as he could. She was on a flight within 4 hours. She landed in Houston the next morning and Thomas picked her up from the airport and they drove in silence for most of the way home because there was nothing that needed to be said and neither of them was ready for the words that would need to come eventually. The funeral was the following Saturday. Small and quiet, the way Margaret had always preferred things. The church was full of people who had known her for decades. Teachers from her school. Parents of students she had taught. People from the neighborhood. People whose children she had shaped in ways they might not have fully known she was shaping. Thomas sat in the front pew with Vivian beside him and looked at the photograph of his wife on the easel at the front of the church and felt a grief so specific and so particular that it could not be reduced to anything general. Vivian stayed for 2 weeks. She helped her father sort through Margaret's things. She held his hand in the evenings when the house was quiet and the day had run out of the small tasks that kept the silence at bay. At the end of the 2 weeks, Thomas told her to go back. Her firm needed her. Her life was there. Margaret would have been furious with anyone who let what she worked for slip because of grief. Vivian protested. Thomas insisted. She went back to London. He stood at the front door and watched her car go down the street and then turned and went back inside the house that was now exactly as quiet as he had been afraid it would be. Now here is where the story takes the turn that destroyed everything Thomas Ellison had built. He had a business partner. A man named Dennis Pryor who had come on board as the financial director of Ellison Construction 7 years earlier, when the company had grown large enough that Thomas could no longer manage both the construction operations and the company's increasingly complex finances by himself. Dennis had come with strong references. He was polished and well-spoken and clearly intelligent. He understood balance sheets and loan structures and contract financing in ways that Thomas, who was brilliant at building things but had never been a numbers man, genuinely needed help with. They had worked together for 7 years. Thomas trusted him. Not just professionally but personally. Dennis had been to the house for dinner. He had met Margaret. He knew Vivian's story because Thomas was the kind of man who talked about his daughter with a pride he made no effort to conceal. 7 years of shared mornings and difficult decisions and problems solved together had built a trust in Thomas that was not suspicious and was not cautious and was not looking for cracks because he had never had a reason to look for them. What Thomas did not know was that Dennis Pryor had been systematically and deliberately stealing from Ellison Construction for the better part of 4 of those 7 years. Not in one large transaction that would have been immediately visible. In layers. Carefully constructed layers that were individually explainable and collectively devastating. He was routing payments through vendor accounts that existed only on paper. He was falsifying invoices from suppliers who did not exist. He was approving loans against company assets and directing the funds into accounts that Thomas had never seen or authorized. He was doing all of this while sitting across from Thomas at their shared conference table every Monday morning, discussing project timelines and procurement schedules and client relationships with a composure that never broke. Think about that for a moment. 7 years of friendship. 7 years of shared work. And for 4 of those years, every single day, this man was looking Thomas in the eye and taking everything he had worked for. Ask yourself what that would do to you. Not just financially, but to your ability to trust your own judgment. To trust anyone. The collapse came in the spring. A routine audit by the company's bank flagged a series of irregularities in the accounts payable records. The bank notified Thomas. Investigators began pulling records. Within 6 weeks, the full scope of what Dennis had done came into view. Millions of dollars had been systematically redirected. The vendor accounts were shells. The loans were real and the proceeds were gone. Investigators estimated the total at slightly over $4 million across 4 years. Dennis, by the time the investigation had progressed far enough to make the picture clear, had been in the process of preparing to disappear for months. He had moved what he could into accounts that were not easily traceable. He had cleared his personal office of anything that mattered. He had transferred the lease on his apartment to someone else's name 3 months earlier. When the warrant was issued, he was already gone. A federal investigation was opened. His passport was flagged. But Dennis Pryor was not in Houston. He was not in Texas. He was not, for several months, findable at all. Thomas was not charged. The investigators interviewed him extensively and reviewed everything he gave them and found no evidence of his involvement or knowledge. He was cleared completely. But the clearance changed very little about what was actually happening to his life. The company was insolvent. The debts were real and enormous and personally guaranteed in ways that Thomas had signed off on when the business was healthy and growing, and no scenario in which those guarantees would be called seemed imaginable. The bank called the loans. The investors who had been funding the development projects pulled out when the headlines about the fraud investigation attached themselves to the company's name regardless of Thomas's personal clearance. Contractors who had been waiting for payments that were now frozen walked off active job sites. The legal fees from cooperating with the investigation and managing the insolvency proceedings consumed what remained of Thomas's personal savings in the first 4 months. And by the end of that year, the company that Thomas Ellison had spent 30 years building from a second-hand truck and a reputation for showing up was gone. Completely. As if it had never existed. He sold the house. He had to. The proceeds reduced the most pressing personal debt obligations. He moved into a small apartment in a part of Houston that was affordable on the income from whatever day labor he could find. He was 60 years old. He went to construction sites and asked for work as a laborer. He carried materials. He mixed concrete. He loaded and unloaded supply trucks alongside men who were 30 years younger than him and who had no idea that the quiet older man working beside them had once run one of the largest construction operations on the Gulf Coast. He did not tell them. He just worked. He came home, heated whatever was cheapest on the stove, and called Vivian on Sunday evenings. Every Sunday evening, without fail, he told her everything was fine. That he was doing some consulting work. That he had been thinking about a new project. That she should not worry and should focus on what she was building because it was extraordinary and she should not let anything distract her from it. He lied to her with love. Every single week. And it never got easier. 6 months after he moved into the apartment, the rent became unmanageable. He had one option that he could see. There was an abandoned house on Mercer Street in a part of South Houston that the city's redevelopment efforts had entirely passed over. The house had been seized by the city from a delinquent owner several years earlier and had sat empty since. No maintenance. No security. No activity. Thomas had known the street from a job he had done on a neighboring property years before. He knew the house. He broke the padlock on the back door quietly one evening in March, set down the single bag he was carrying, and stood in the dark interior listening to the silence. The floors were warped and soft in places from old water damage. The walls had patches of damp near the ceiling in the back rooms. The side window was cracked and someone had put a board over it from the outside. But the roof was intact where it mattered. The kitchen plumbing ran cold water. And Thomas, who knew wiring the way most people know their own handwriting, got one circuit running off the main panel within a day of moving in. He set up a cot in the back bedroom. He bought a small camp stove and 2 pots. He got a battery-powered lantern and a small battery radio that he kept on low in the evenings because the silence in the house without it was a specific kind of heavy that he found difficult to carry alone. He bought groceries from a dollar store 4 blocks away and whatever fresh food he could afford from a market 1 block further. He told himself it was temporary. He told himself something would shift. He told himself he would find a way. And on Sunday evenings he called his daughter and told her everything was fine. He had been living in that abandoned house on Mercer Street for 14 months when Vivian came home. If you are still watching at this point, drop a comment right now with the words, "I am still here." Let us see who is truly following this story all the way through, because what comes next is the part that is going to hit you somewhere very deep. Vivian had not planned the trip to Houston out of any specific concern. She had been in the United States for a series of investor meetings along the East Coast, Boston, and New York over 4 days, and she had decided to add 3 days in Houston at the end of the schedule because she had not been home in over a year and because there was a part of her that had been registering a low-grade unease about her father for several months that she had not fully examined or named. His Sunday phone calls had started to feel slightly off in a way she could not precisely define. Not alarmed. Not wrong in any specific detail. Just slightly off. The way a note played correctly can still feel like it is sitting in the wrong key. She told herself she was overthinking it. She was busy and tired and the kind of person who builds high-stakes narratives around small data points when her analytical mind is running at full speed. She booked the Houston extension of the trip and told herself it was just a visit. It would be good to see him. She had been meaning to come back for months. She landed in Houston on a Wednesday morning in October, gray and cold for the time of year. She checked into the hotel in Midtown and spent the morning on calls. At 2 in the afternoon she rented a car from the lot connected to the hotel and entered the address her father had given her when she called to tell him she was coming. The address was on Mercer Street. She did not recognize it. She assumed he had moved at some point after the house was sold, which she had known about in a vague way from a conversation that had happened quickly and without much detail. She had told herself at the time that it made sense for him to downsize. The big house was too large for one person. She had not pushed for specifics because he had sounded fine and she had been in the middle of a closing and the conversation had moved on. She drove south from the hotel, the city becoming quieter and then quieter still as she moved away from the commercial center toward the older residential neighborhoods that had not been touched by Houston's redevelopment cycles. The streets narrowed. The houses grew more sparse and less maintained. The driveways were empty or occupied by cars that had not moved in a long time. She followed the navigation to Mercer Street and pulled up to the address and stopped the car. She sat there with the engine running, looking through the windshield. The house was clearly not occupied in any normal sense. It had not been maintained in years. The paint on the exterior was so far gone in places that the bare wood was visible beneath it. The boards of the front porch were visibly warped and uneven from a distance. The side window was covered with a piece of lumber that had been nailed over the frame from the outside. The front yard was a mass of overgrown grass and weeds that had grown up over the bottom porch steps entirely. She sat in the car for a full minute. Then she turned the engine off, got out, and walked up to the porch. The boards shifted and groaned under her feet in a way that made her step carefully. She stood in front of the door with the peeling paint and the tarnished hardware and raised her hand and knocked. A pause. The faint sound of a radio from somewhere inside, playing something old and instrumental. Then footsteps on a floor that sounded hollow and uncertain. Then the door opened. Thomas Ellison stood in the doorway in the dim light that filtered through the boards and the cracked glass of the windows behind him. He was wearing the flannel shirt that Vivian recognized from years ago, its collar frayed now in a way she had never seen it before. His hair had gone fully gray in the time since she had last seen him, which had been at Margaret's funeral over 2 years earlier. He was thinner than she remembered him being then. His hands, which she had always thought of as the most capable hands she had ever seen, were rough and cracked in a way that spoke of work done without protection against the elements. He looked at her face when the door opened and something moved across his expression that was not quite surprise and not quite relief and was not the ordinary expression of a father answering the door for a daughter who was visiting. It was something older and more tired and more complicated than any of those things. Vivian looked at him. Then she looked past him into the interior of the house. The cot against the wall of what had been a living room, with a thin blanket folded at the foot. The camp stove on the kitchen counter with a single pot beside it. The bare bulb on its wire hanging from the ceiling. The battery lantern on the floor beside the cot. The small radio on a ledge beside the kitchen door, playing low. A neat stack of library books on the floor beside the cot. A single pair of work boots by the door, worn down to where the sole was separating at the toe. She took all of it in. She stood there on that porch in her coat with the cold October air around her, and she looked at the life her father had been living while she was in London, while she was on her jet, while she was in her penthouse, while she was closing deals and going to award dinners and being photographed for business publications and telling herself she would come home soon. She said, very quietly, "Dad." Just the word. Just his name for her. And the weight of everything she did not yet know but could already feel was in it completely. Thomas stepped back from the door and said, "Come inside." His voice was the same. Steady and warm, the way it had always been. But the words were quiet and the expression behind them was the expression of a man who had been waiting for this moment to arrive and was now, after 14 months of Sunday phone calls, standing inside it. Vivian stepped through the door and into the house and Thomas closed it behind her. They sat on the floor of that house for 3 hours. There were no chairs. Thomas brought a thin blanket from the cot and folded it and placed it on the warped wood floor between the camp stove and the wall, and they sat against the wall the way two people sit when there is no furniture and nothing to perform and all that is left is the conversation that has been postponed for too long. The battery lantern was on the floor between them. The radio had gone off at some point. The house was very quiet outside of their voices. Vivian asked him once to tell her everything, from the beginning. And then she stopped talking and let him tell it. Thomas went through all of it. He started with Margaret's diagnosis, which Vivian had not known was coming and received with a stillness that was harder to watch than tears would have been. He told her about the decision not to call her. He told her what Margaret had asked for and why and how he had honored it even though it had cost him something he still could not fully name. He told her about the final months and the Tuesday in February and coming home to the house that night and sitting in the kitchen alone. He told her about Dennis Pryor. He went through the whole arc of it methodically and without drama, the way a man tells a story that he has been living with alone for long enough that the acute pain has been processed down into something quieter and more structural. The vendor accounts. The loans. The investigation. The clearance that changed nothing financial. The bank calling the loans. The house. The apartment. The day labor. The work boots with the sole separating at the toe. The Mercer Street house. The 14 months. When he finished, the house was so quiet that Vivian could hear her own breathing. She sat with her hands in her lap and looked at the floor for a long moment. Then she looked up at him and asked the one question she had to ask. She asked why. She said his name first. She said it the way a daughter says a father's name when she needs him to understand that what she is asking is not a rebuke and not an accusation but something closer to a wound that she needs to understand before it can close. She said, "Why did you not call me?" She said, "I have been in London building something you helped make possible. I have more money than I will ever be able to spend in this life. You have been sleeping on a cot in an abandoned house for over a year and answering my Sunday calls and telling me you were fine. Why? Thomas was quiet for a long moment. He looked at his hands resting on his knees, those rough and cracked hands that had built buildings and carried his daughter on his shoulders and waved goodbye at an airport years ago. Then he looked at her face and said, because watching you succeed was the last good thing left in my life. And I was not willing to be the reason it slowed down. Vivian looked at the ceiling of that abandoned house. She pressed her palms flat on the floor on either side of her. She breathed in and breathed out. Then she said, Dad. You are the reason it exists. Thomas did not say anything. He did not need to. The lantern cast its flat, steady light across both of them and the house was quiet, and outside on Mercer Street the city continued doing what cities do, entirely indifferent to what was happening inside this broken building where a father and a daughter were finally, after 14 months and years of Sunday phone calls, telling each other the truth. Think about that for a moment before we go further. Think about what it takes to love someone so much that you sleep on a cot in an abandoned house rather than let them see you struggling. Think about what it costs a person to carry that alone. And then think about the people in your own life right now. The ones who answer your calls and tell you everything is fine. Is everything actually fine? How long has it been since you asked in a way that made space for a different answer? Vivian did not go back to the hotel that night. She stayed in the abandoned house on Mercer Street with her father, sitting on the floor and talking until the lantern battery was running low and the night had gone very late outside. They talked about Margaret. Thomas told her things he had not been able to say at the funeral, things about the last weeks and the last conversations and the specific way the house felt the morning after the hospital called. Vivian told him things about what it had felt like to be in London, building something enormous while carrying a grief she had not known how to talk about because talking about it made it more real and she had needed it to stay manageable enough that she could keep working. They talked about the business. Thomas walked her through the whole picture of what had happened with Dennis Pryor, the details that had not been in the brief conversation they had managed to have in the chaos of the months after the fraud was discovered. He explained it the way a builder explains a structural failure, which is carefully and honestly and with no softening of the parts that were his responsibility to know sooner. Vivian listened to all of it without interrupting. She asked good questions. She was, among other things, one of the sharpest financial minds in her generation, and listening to the mechanics of what Dennis had done and how he had concealed it activated a part of her that was clinical and precise and completely separate from the part of her that was sitting on a warped wooden floor looking at her father in the lantern light. She left early the following morning to go back to the hotel. She needed to think. She needed a shower and clean clothes and several hours alone with a computer and her phone. She drove to the hotel through the early morning Houston streets and parked and went up to the room and did not sit down for a long time. She stood at the window looking at the city below and ran through everything Thomas had told her and let the full picture assemble itself in her mind the way she assembled pictures of companies she was considering investing in, which was completely and without flinching from the parts that were ugly. When she had the full picture she sat down at the desk and opened her laptop and began making calls. She cancelled the rest of her East Coast schedule. She called her managing partner in London and told him she was extending her time in Houston by an indefinite period, likely 3 to 4 weeks minimum, and that he was managing the daily operations until further notice. He asked if everything was all right. She said it would be. Then she started making the other calls. By noon she had spoken to a Houston real estate agent and arranged to rent a properly furnished house in a residential neighborhood in northwest Houston, available from the following Monday. By 2 in the afternoon she had identified a Houston-based attorney who specialized in business fraud and financial recovery litigation and had booked a consultation for the following morning. By 4 she had driven back to Mercer Street and sat down with her father and told him what she had arranged. Thomas looked at her for a long moment. Then he said he could not let her do this. Vivian looked at her father with the expression she had been told by more than one person across her career was the most effective negotiating tool she possessed. She said, "You already let me do everything that got me here. Now it is your turn." Thomas did not have a response to that. Which was, as he had always known, the sign that the argument was over. Thomas moved into the rented house in Northwest Houston on a Monday morning. Vivian had furnished it simply but properly. A real bed with a good mattress. A kitchen with food in it. A living room with a couch and a table and a television. A bathroom with hot water and enough pressure to actually shower rather than just rinse. Thomas walked through the rooms quietly on that first morning and did not say very much. Vivian watched him run his hand along the kitchen counter as if checking the quality of the material, the way a builder checks a surface, and she understood that he was not just checking the counter. He was recalibrating. Orienting to a life that did not involve waking up on a cot in a cold house and going to a construction site to carry materials for men who did not know his name. The attorney meeting happened the following morning. Vivian sat beside her father in the conference room on the 14th floor of a building in downtown Houston and listened as the attorney, a woman named Patricia Howe who had spent 20 years handling financial fraud litigation, went through the records Thomas had preserved in a storage unit he had kept even through the worst of it. The records were thorough. Thomas was the kind of man who did not throw things away, particularly documents, and this habit that had seemed irrelevant during the years of the fraud turned out to be the foundation of the case. Patricia Howe looked at the documents for 2 hours. She asked specific questions. She took notes. At the end of the meeting she told them that the civil case had merit and that the federal fraud investigation against Dennis Pryor, who had been located in Nevada 6 months earlier and was facing federal charges from a separate scheme, created an environment in which a civil claim was not just possible but likely to be productive. She said the word likely with the careful precision of an attorney who means something specific by it and does not want it misunderstood as a guarantee. Vivian told her to proceed. Thomas looked at his hands on the conference room table and did not say anything. He did not need to. 3 months after Vivian came home to Mercer Street, a new company was registered in the state of Texas with the Secretary of State's office. Ellison Infrastructure Partners. Thomas Ellison was listed as founder and chief construction officer. Vivian sat on the board. The capital came from Vivian. The expertise came from both of them, which was the actual balance of what they each brought, even if the formal structure said otherwise. The first contract was a commercial renovation project for a medical office building on the east side of Houston, mid-sized, the kind of project that a new firm could execute properly and complete with the kind of quality that builds reputation. Thomas was on the site from the first morning of groundwork. He put on his work boots, the new ones that Vivian had bought him without comment and left by the front door of the rented house, and he drove to the site and walked it with the foreman and began doing the thing that he had been doing since he was 17 years old, which was looking at a building and understanding what it needed. On the third day he identified a framing error on the second floor that would have caused a costly structural problem 6 months after completion. He found it the way he had always found things, by looking carefully at the right detail at the right moment and knowing what he was seeing. He corrected it before it became a problem. The project manager, who had been in construction for 15 years, came to find Vivian privately at the end of that week and told her that Thomas was one of the best site presences he had ever worked alongside. Vivian thanked him and said she already knew. The project completed on time and under budget. The client was satisfied in a way that generated 2 referrals within the first month of completion. The second project was larger. The third was larger still. Vivian ran the financial structure and the client relationships from a combination of Houston and London, spending more time in Houston than she had spent anywhere other than London in years. She found she did not mind this. She found she had missed the city more than she had known, and she found that working beside her father, watching him move through a job site and do the thing he had been born to do, was one of the most grounding experiences she had had in years. There was a quality to his presence on a construction site that was almost impossible to describe to someone who had not seen it. It was competence in its purest form. Competence without performance. Without ego. He was simply someone who knew how to build things correctly and cared deeply that they were built correctly. Watching it every day recalibrated something in Vivian that years of boardrooms and deal sheets and asset valuations had slowly, without her noticing, moved out of alignment. The civil case progressed. It was slow, the way civil cases always are, and the attorney was careful to manage expectations about the timeline. Dennis Pryor, facing federal charges in Nevada that were more serious than the civil claim, entered into plea negotiations with federal prosecutors that were ongoing. The civil case was complicated by this but not blocked by it. Patricia Howe was patient and thorough and communicated regularly and clearly. Vivian trusted her. Thomas let Vivian manage it, which was the right call for both of them because Thomas had spent enough of his energy on the aftermath of what Dennis had done and was now spending his energy on something that mattered more to him, which was building something real again. 1 year after Vivian had stood on the porch of the Mercer Street house and knocked, Ellison Infrastructure Partners had completed 6 projects, had 4 more under active contract, and had a pipeline of prospective work that suggested the 7th year would be the firm's largest yet. The legal case was approaching a resolution. Patricia Howe had communicated 3 weeks earlier that Dennis Pryor's federal plea negotiations had reached a point where the civil claim was likely to be settled in a way that recovered a meaningful portion of what had been taken, not all of it, not nearly all of it, but enough to matter. Vivian had told her father this on a Tuesday evening over dinner in the Northwest Houston house. Thomas had listened to the number. He had been quiet for a moment. Then he had said, Margaret would have found a way to put that money to use before the check cleared. Vivian had laughed. It was the kind of laugh that sits very close to the other thing and knows it. She said, she would have had a plan for it by the time we got off the phone with Patricia. Thomas smiled. He looked down at his plate for a moment and then looked back up. He said, she would have been proud of what you are doing. Vivian said, she would have been proud of what we are doing. Thomas did not argue with that. He was living in the Northwest Houston house now as a permanent arrangement, though the conversation about whether it was permanent had never actually happened, which was the way both of them preferred it. He had a proper bed and a kitchen that worked and a truck he had chosen himself, a used one, practical and reliable, the kind of truck a builder drives rather than the kind a builder buys to be seen in. He drove it to the job sites every morning. He called Vivian on Sunday evenings when she was in London or Singapore or wherever the week had taken her. The calls were different now. Not longer necessarily, not more formal, but different in a quality that was hard to name precisely. He told her when things were difficult. She told him when she was tired. They talked about Margaret sometimes. They talked about Gerald, Thomas's father, who had died years earlier and whose work boots Thomas had kept in the garage of the Houston house for reasons he had never fully explained and did not need to. They talked about the firm and the projects and the things they were building together. The calls were real now. Both of them were telling the truth on Sunday evenings. And that difference, small as it might sound to someone who had not lived inside the alternative for years, was everything. There is a version of this story that is about money. About a construction empire lost to fraud and a billionaire daughter who came home and rebuilt it. That version is accurate, but it is not the real story. The real story is about a gap. A gap that opened slowly, over years, between two people who loved each other completely and communicated regularly and told each other everything was fine, and who were, in the process, each carrying something enormous entirely alone. Thomas was carrying the loss of his wife and the loss of his company and the loss of the life he had built and the shame of being a man who had been deceived by someone he trusted and the terror of asking his daughter for help because asking would make it real in a way that was harder to carry than the silence. Vivian was carrying the momentum of a company that was growing faster than she could fully process, and the guilt of a daughter who had not been present for her mother's illness, and the distance from the place she came from that accumulates quietly over years abroad until the distance has become its own kind of geography that you stop fully noticing. Both of them were acting entirely from love. And both of them, in acting from love, had allowed a gap to open between them that had been growing for years and that only closed because Vivian got on a plane and drove to an address she did not recognize and knocked on a door that she was not fully prepared for what was behind. How many of us are living inside a version of this right now? Not necessarily as extreme. Not necessarily as dramatic. But how many of us have a parent or a grandparent or someone who raised us and sacrificed for us who is answering our calls and saying they are fine when they are not? How many of us are moving so fast through our own lives that the fine is enough and we do not slow down to investigate it? How many of us have told ourselves we will visit soon, that we will call properly soon, that we will find a way to slow down and actually check in rather than just check in, and then the week goes by and the month goes by and we have not done it? Thomas Ellison slept on a cot in a broken house for 14 months. Not because his daughter did not love him. She loved him completely. But because the love was not accompanied by the presence and the attention that love requires in order to actually protect the people we love from suffering alone. That is the harder truth inside this story. The one that deserves to stay with you after the ending. Think about who in your life might need you to slow down enough to ask the question that is harder than how are you. Think about who might need you to push past the fine answer and sit in the discomfort of the real one. Because some people, the ones who love us most, the ones who gave us everything that made us who we are, have learned over decades of protecting us that the safest and kindest thing they can do is answer fine. And sometimes the only way to get to the truth is to show up at the door and knock. Even when you are afraid of what might be on the other side. There is one final moment in this story that needs to be told. 8 months after Vivian came home to Mercer Street, Ellison Infrastructure Partners broke ground on a project that was different from the others. A residential development on a lot in East Houston. Not luxury apartments. Affordable housing. 12 units. The kind of housing that families actually need and that developers with better margins consistently build elsewhere. It was not the most financially optimal project the firm had taken on that year. Vivian had been the one who brought it to Thomas. She had found the lot and the financing and the opportunity and she had brought it to him and told him what she had in mind. Thomas had looked at the project numbers and then looked at her and said, "This is not the best return on this capital." Vivian had said, "No. But it is the best use of it." Thomas had held her gaze for a moment. Then he had said, "All right." Just that. All right. On the morning the construction team broke ground, Thomas was on the site before anyone else arrived. Vivian got there 30 minutes after him. She pulled up in her car and got out and walked to where he was standing at the edge of the lot, looking at the machinery and the crew setting up and the Houston sky above all of it, pale and early and just beginning to lighten from the east. She stood beside him. Neither of them spoke for a while. The machine started and the ground began to break and the work that Thomas Ellison had been doing his whole life, the work of building something real and useful and intended to last, began again on a morning in East Houston on a lot that would eventually become home to 12 families who would not know the full story of how it came to be built. After a while Vivian said, "You built this city once, Dad." She paused. "And now we are going to keep building it." Thomas did not say anything. He watched the machines working the ground. He put his hands in his jacket pockets. And on his face, in the early morning light on an East Houston construction site, was the expression of a man who has come back from somewhere very far away and is finally, after a long time, standing on solid ground. Some of the most powerful love in this world makes no noise at all. It sleeps on a cot in an abandoned house and answers the phone on Sunday evenings and says everything is fine. It sacrifices without announcing the sacrifice. It protects without revealing what it is protecting you from. And sometimes it waits, quietly and without complaint, for someone to show up at the door and knock. Thomas Ellison waited for 14 months. He never called. He never asked. He never said a single word on a Sunday evening that would have told Vivian the truth because he had decided, somewhere in the wreckage of everything he had lost, that her life going forward was worth more than his comfort and that a father's job, even when the child is a grown woman building a billion-dollar firm in London, is still to carry the weight so she does not have to. He was wrong about one thing. He was wrong that carrying the weight alone was the same as protecting her. Because Vivian did not need to be protected from knowing. She needed to know so she could do what she actually did, which was come home and help rebuild everything that had been taken from a man who had given everything to her. Now we want to know what this story made you feel. Drop a comment right now and tell us. What would you have done if you had been Vivian and you pulled up to that address on Mercer Street? Would you have noticed something was wrong sooner? Would you have pushed past the fine answers on the Sunday calls? And if you have a parent or a grandparent right now who answers your check-ins with fine, with okay, with don't worry about me, when did you last push past that answer and sit with them long enough to find out what is actually true? Because this story is not just about Thomas and Vivian Ellison. It is about every Sunday phone call that ended too quickly. Every visit that kept being postponed. Every person who was sleeping on a cot somewhere while someone who loved them was moving fast through a life that person had made possible. Share this with someone who needs to hear it today. Not someone who needs the story. Someone who needs the reminder that the people who gave us everything are sometimes the last ones to ask for anything. Put their name in your phone right now. Not a text. A call. A real one. Ask them how they actually are. And listen for longer than feels comfortable. Because sometimes the most important thing you can do is exactly that simple. And if this story moved you the way we intended it to, subscribe to this channel right now so you never miss another one. Because the next story we are going to tell is one that will change the way you think about the people who are standing right in front of you. And we would hate for you to miss it.